Emily from Homemade Emily Jane. Today I'm going to teach you how to make 4 Scrappy coasters. These Scrappy coasters are made with strips of fabric, and so they come out to have a little stripe design when you're done. We'll get started with the materials first. First, grab your scraps. I picked out a bunch of coordinating scraps that are gray and blue. As you can see, these are all scraps that are about 10 inches long at least, and then at least roughly 2 inches wide. Of course, whatever scraps you have, we can make work. Next, you'll also need batting scraps for the inside of the coasters. I have here 2 strips that are each 10 inches wide by 5 inches. I'll end up cutting these down to, I'll have 4 5-inch squares. And then for the back of the coaster, you'll also need 4 5-inch squares. I have here a 10-inch square that I will cut into 4 5-inch squares. You'll also need thread, a rotary cutter, and a ruler for this project. Once you have all of your scraps picked out, you'll want to press them flat. Many of mine have already been pressed from the previous quilt I was working on, so I will set those aside and neatly organizing them into a nice pile. And then some of them aren't quite as ready, so I'll take my iron. These bigger pieces will end up getting trimmed down. Once your fabric scraps are all pressed flat, you'll trim them so that they're all 10 inches long, like shown. So now all of our scraps are nice and neatly organized. Next up, we'll trim each of our strips so that they're a little bit wonky. So for this one, I'm going to cut off the selvage but angle the ruler so that it goes in a diagonal, leaving at least a 1/2 inch at one end because of seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and try to leave it around 3/4 inches there. Cut it off, and now we have a strip like that. And I'll go ahead and do all of my strips into wonky arrangements. So for this one, I'll cut it off that direction, and then I'll also cut it this direction to make it nice and skinny. So if we were to sew these together, it would have like a diagonal edge to it. So I'll do that for all of my fabrics. Alright, so now that your pieces are cut, go ahead and organize them into 2 piles. I'm going to do a light and a dark pile. So as you can see, some of them don't really fit into one category or the other, so I'll leave them in the middle for now, and then we'll decide later what to do with them. So I've got a lot of these nice light gray colors, a lot of the dark blue colors. I've got some darker gray, some lighter gray, and then I'll put these blues in with the grays. So now I have 2 sections, and to make the actual panel for the coasters, I'm going to layer these with 1 light and 1 dark all the way across, rotating which colors I want to use. You don't have to follow the light, dark, light, dark. I might even mix it up here how I put a dark gray and a dark blue together. But the key is to have like random fun design here. And so now, as you can see, I've got a pretty good amount of strips out. And then you can take a step back and take a look at it and see where you might want to switch out some colors or change up the design a little bit. Once we lose the seam allowance, it will get smaller. So I have plenty of extra scraps out here to the side ready to go. But we'll start with this. And the next thing we'll do is, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew them all together into one panel that is at least 10 inches by 10 inches. Now that I'm at my sewing machine, I will very carefully, in sets of 2, take the fabrics right sides together and sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, because I like to chain sew, I will do sets of 2 to do it all the way across. And then I'll go back and attach the sets together. The next thing that we'll do is press. And we can press here either pulling them open and pressing, or just pressing to the dark side. So I'll go do that now with my iron. I personally chose to press my pieces open, like shown, and then I laid them out again to rearrange the color placement and make sure that I still liked how it looked. Next, we'll sew these sections together and measure the block to see if it's a full 10 inches. So just like we did before, we take the pieces and we put them right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, I'll press these and repeat the process to get it all into one block. Once your pieces are sewn together, you'll take your panel and measure it. It should come to 10 inches. So as you can see, this is the 10-inch line and we're still short. So we'll take some more scraps and sew one on each end. And hopefully that gets us to our 10-inch mark. And then, of course, we'll press those 2 final seams open and remeasure the block. And now it looks like our block is big enough to turn into coasters. Once you're done sewing your scraps together, you should have something that looks like this. And it should be 10 inches square. This one obviously is not trimmed yet, so I'll go ahead and trim it into 10 inches square, and then from there I'm going to trim it to 4 5-inch square pieces. The first thing we'll do to square off our block is to come to the very edge and look for the shortest side and trim from there to get off all of that excess. And then from this side we will make sure that it is flush, flat, and trim straight up. So now this corner is square and we just have to square off the other corner as well. So from here, I'll measure just to make sure it comes to 10 inches. You can also use markings on a mat. So for here, if I line up this edge with the mat and then I count 10 across, it'll tell me where to line up the ruler for the next cut. It's okay if it's a tiny bit off. Remember, it's just coasters. And then one more side here to trim to make sure that it is all final and square. So now we have this as a square. We will cut it into 4 5-inch blocks, and those will be our finished coasters. So here's what it looks like. You'll see the seams on the back, nice and pretty. And you'll see now that we've trimmed it, they all look a little bit different. This one has some seam allowance hanging off the edge there. We'll trim that off just so that it doesn't get in the way later. Next, we will trim our back of the coasters in the same manner. We want 4 5-inch squares. I have a 10-inch square, so I just need to cut it in half twice. And finally our batting too. So this is 2 layers. All right, so now we have batting, backing, and coaster tops. So now we make our sandwich, but this gets a little different than a typical quilt. So you'll start by placing your batting down first, and then put your backing right side up, and then place the top of the coaster right side down, all lined up on top of each other, and pin at all 4 corners, like so. Next, we will sew around the edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but we'll leave a 2-inch opening on one of the sides. To begin sewing, start by stitching 3 stitches in place and then stitch around the edges of the coaster. You'll stop with your needle down to turn the corner. Once you get to the side that you started on, stitch 3 stitches in place and then trim your threads. Next, we take out the pins and we snip the corners like this. Be very careful not to snip the thread that you just sewed. And then now we turn it inside out. Make sure that you're taking the bottom of the coaster and the top of the coaster and flipping it from there. And now you'll see that we want to make our corners a little bit more sharp. So to do that, you can take I'm going to use my little screwdriver actually, but you can take any sort of object that isn't too sharp, but something to poke out the corners. Once you get those to your satisfaction, go ahead and press it nice and flat. Once you've pressed your coaster, it should look a little like this. You'll see the inside edge is pressed in a 1/4 inch on both sides. The next step is to stitch all the way around the edges at around 1/8 of an inch, and we'll start where the opening is. So first, stitch in place 3 stitches to fix your stitch. And then continue sewing around all edges of the coaster. This is another place where you'll keep your needle down so you can pivot at the corner. When you get back to where you started, stitch a couple more stitches and then lock your stitch in place. And then you can trim your threads. Once you're done, you'll see you have a couple threads left. You can choose to bury your threads or just snip them off. And voila! There's a coaster for you. Go ahead and repeat the process for the other 3. And that is how you make 4 coordinating striped Scrappy coasters. I hope you enjoyed this video. I do have one more tip I want to share with you that I realized that I screwed up on while I was making one of mine. So when you sew around the 4 edges and leave an opening, make sure that you leave your opening along one of the long edge pieces and not where the seams are all joining. So I'll pull this one up real close. You can see how the seams are kind of funny looking, just a teeny tiny bit, not enough to make me redo it, but it is enough to bug me. So I left my opening along this edge, and then when I turned it inside out, those seams started coming apart. Not great. So go ahead and do your opening along one of the parts that don't have a seam, and you'll be a lot more happy with the result. So anyway, I hope you love your striped Scrappy coasters as much as I do. They make really great gifts for friends, and it's a really great way to use up your scraps. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Leave a comment below telling me what you liked or what you didn't like and how I can improve to make better videos in the future. Find more tips and tricks over at homemadeemilyjane.com. Thank you.